There's something unfinished about the Sumerians, not unfinished in the sense of ruins or broken walls, but unfinished in a deeper way, as if their story was interrupted mid-sentence, as if they were trying to tell us something and ran out of time. When we talk about ancient civilizations, history usually follows a familiar rhythm. Small beginnings, gradual progress, mistakes, failures, corrections, simple tools evolving into complex systems over generations. But Sumer does not follow that rhythm. It arrives already composed, already organized, already fluent, and that alone should make us pause. Because the Sumerians appear in the archaeological record around 3500 BCE, and they do not look like beginners. They look like inheritors. Their cities are planned, their irrigation systems work, their mathematics is precise, their writing system is capable of recording law, astronomy, medicine, trade, and myth from the very beginning. This is not how civilizations usually start. Most cultures leave behind a long trail of trial and error. We find crude tools beneath refined ones. We see writing systems struggling to form, symbols changing, simplifying, evolving. But when we look at Sumer, that trail feels strangely absent. It's as if the rehearsal never happened, as if the stage lights came on, and the performance had already begun. That's the first sense in which Sumer feels unfinished. Not because it failed, but because it feels like the middle of a much longer story. And the Sumerians themselves seem to know it. When their scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay, they did not write like people inventing something new. They wrote like people preserving something old. Again and again in temple inscriptions, legal texts, and royal dedications, a phrase appears in different forms. This is the restoration of what was before. Not creation, restoration. That word matters. Restoration implies loss. It implies damage. It implies something broken that once existed in a more complete form. So the question becomes unavoidable. What were they restoring? To understand why this question matters, we need to slow down and sit with the evidence, not rushing toward answers, but allowing the discomfort to remain. Because discomfort is where this story actually lives. Take their writing system, cuneiform. Cuneiform appears suddenly, already complex. In its earliest known form, it contains hundreds of symbols. Not pictographs slowly turning abstract, but a hybrid system combining logograms, phonetics, and grammatical markers. This level of sophistication normally takes centuries to develop. And yet, there is no clear proto-cuneiform stage beneath it. No awkward learning phase. No competing systems trying and failing. It's simply there, as if someone already knew how writing should work. Then, there is their mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal, which we still use today to measure time and angles. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Base 60 is not intuitive. It's elegant, but it's not obvious. Someone chose it deliberately because it is divisible by many numbers, making calculation efficient for trade, astronomy, and engineering. But the Sumerians never describe inventing this system. They describe learning it. Their educational tablets don't say, "We developed this method." They say, "From distant days the scribal art has been practiced." From distant days, not from us, not from our ancestors, from somewhere further back. And then there are their cities. Uruk, one of the earliest Sumerian cities, covers hundreds of hectares in its earliest major phase. It has defensive walls kilometers long. It has districts for different types of labor. It has temples aligned with celestial events. Building something like this requires planning, logistics, mathematics, leadership, and institutional memory. It requires people who already know how to coordinate large populations. Normally, we would expect to see smaller experiments before something like Uruk emerges, villages becoming towns, towns becoming cities. But in southern Mesopotamia, that transition feels compressed, almost skipped. As if the knowledge needed to build cities arrived faster than the population learned it through experience. This pattern repeats everywhere we look. Writing without a learning curve, mathematics without experimentation, architecture without visible mistakes, law without a long record of case-by-case refinement. None of this proves that something impossible happened, but it strongly suggests that something is missing, and the Sumerians never tried to hide that fact. Their myths don't celebrate invention. They don't tell stories about discovering writing or creating civilization from nothing. Instead, they talk about gods who taught, about knowledge that was given, about a time before a great disruption when the world functioned differently. They divide time into before and after, before the flood, after the flood. Whether we read those stories literally or symbolically, the structure is the same. A break, a rupture, a loss of continuity. And when we read Sumerian texts slowly, without trying to force them into modern categories, they don't sound like fantasy. They sound like memory, fragmented, mythologized, but anchored to something real. This is where many modern discussions become uncomfortable, because acknowledging that something feels unfinished about Sumer doesn't mean accepting wild conclusions. It simply means admitting that our current explanation feels incomplete, and incompleteness is not weakness, it's honesty. History is not a solved puzzle. It's a landscape with gaps, eroded paths, and missing layers. And Sumer sits at one of the deepest gaps we know. They appear too suddenly, they know too much too early, and they insist, repeatedly, that they are restoring something older than themselves. That insistence is easy to dismiss as religious language. But when religious language aligns with archaeological anomalies, linguistic isolation, and unexplained sophistication, it stops being convenient to ignore. Something feels unresolved, something feels paused, like a story that never reached its ending. And maybe that's why the Sumerians still pull at us so strongly. Not because they explain our origins, but because they remind us that we may not know them as well as we think. And in the quiet hours when certainty loosens its grip, that unfinished feeling becomes harder to dismiss, because unfinished stories don't disappear. They wait. If the cities of Sumer feel unfinished, their language feels even more so. Because languages are not supposed to appear fully formed. They grow, they mutate, they leave behind ancestors, cousins, transitional stages. Linguists can usually trace a language the way geologists trace sedimentary layers, backward through time. Sound changes, borrowed words, grammatical shifts. Even when a language dies, it leaves fingerprints behind, loan words embedded in newer tongues, structural quirks that don't quite belong. But Sumerian does not behave like that. It appears in writing around 3300 BCE, already mature, already complex, already capable of expressing abstract ideas, legal reasoning, poetic metaphor, and precise technical instruction. And it has no known relatives, none. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known family, no clear ancestors, no descendants. That alone makes it rare, but the timing makes it unsettling, because Sumerian doesn't emerge early in human history when we might expect linguistic chaos and experimentation. It emerges late enough that neighboring languages already exist. Semitic languages surrounded Sumer, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and yet Sumerian shares almost nothing fundamental with them. Its grammar is agglutinative. Meaning is built by stacking prefixes and suffixes onto root words, like beads on a string. This structure resembles languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese, languages spoken thousands of kilometers away, with no clear historical connection. And even those languages have families, ancestors. Sumerian stands alone. This should not happen. Languages do not spontaneously generate in isolation. They evolve from earlier tongues spoken by earlier populations. So where is Sumerian's past? One explanation is that its relatives existed but disappeared. Languages can vanish if the people who speak them vanish, which raises a more difficult question. What would cause an entire language family to disappear without trace, leaving only one survivor? Catastrophe, sudden collapse, population loss on a scale large enough to erase cultural continuity, and the Sumerians were very clear about something else. They believed such a catastrophe had happened. Their texts divide time sharply into two periods, not metaphorically, structurally. Before the flood, after the flood. This division appears everywhere, in myths, king lists, ritual texts, and cosmology. It is not a poetic flourish, it is a chronological boundary. And when archaeologists excavated Sumerian cities, they found something strange. At sites like Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish, there is a thick layer of sterile clay separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. No artifacts, no tools, no signs of gradual deposition, just clean flood silt. Above it, Sumerian civilization, Below it, something older. Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s, initially thought he had reached virgin soil. Then he dug deeper, and beneath the flood layer, human habitation resumed. 2 cities, one buried beneath water and mud, one built directly on top. The flood was not global, but for the people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, it erased everything they knew. Fields, homes, archives, languages. If Sumerian was already spoken before that flood, then its isolation begins to make sense. It would be the last surviving branch of a drowned linguistic tree, a fossil language, preserved not because it thrived, but because someone chose to write it down before it vanished. And the Sumerians treated their language exactly like that. Even after Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of daily life, Sumerian did not disappear. It became sacred. Scribes continued learning it. Priests continued using it. Kings commissioned inscriptions in it. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian survived as a scholarly and ritual language long after no one spoke it at home. Like Latin in medieval Europe, not a living tongue but a vessel of inherited knowledge. Babylonian scribes created bilingual dictionaries, translating Sumerian into Akkadian so its texts would not be lost. One scribe even added a note while copying a Sumerian hymn, for the ancient words must not be altered. They contain wisdom from before the Great Change. Before the Great Change, they never explain what that change was. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. This behavior is telling. People don't preserve dead languages unless those languages are connected to something valuable. Power, authority, knowledge, or memory. And Sumerian texts consistently frame themselves as preservation, not innovation. They don't say, "We discovered this." They say, "This was handed down." They don't say, "We created." They say, "We restored." The language itself becomes part of the message, a container holding something older than the civilization using it. And that makes Sumer feel unfinished in another sense, because if their language is a remnant, then Sumer itself may be a remnant. Not the beginning of civilization, but what survived its interruption. This reframes how we read their myths. Instead of asking whether the stories are literally true, we ask a different question. What kind of memory would need myth to survive? Imagine trying to describe advanced processes without technical language, without scientific concepts, without terminology for biology, astronomy, or engineering. You would use metaphor, you would use narrative, you would use gods, not because you were primitive, but because language had not yet caught up with experience. The Sumerian creation stories are strange in this regard. They are procedural. They describe steps, failures, adjustments. Humans are not created instantly. They are refined. This is unusual for myth. Most creation myths describe perfection from the start. But Sumerian texts read more like documentation filtered through symbolic language, as if someone was trying to preserve how something happened, not why. This doesn't mean the stories should be taken literally, but it does mean they shouldn't be dismissed casually, because they align with the same pattern we see elsewhere: sudden emergence, inherited knowledge, a language with no ancestors, a civilization that insists it is restoring something lost. All of these point to interruption, to something broken mid-flow, and that sense of interruption is what lingers. It's not that Sumer explains everything, it's that it refuses to sit comfortably at the beginning. It feels like a chapter written after the prologue was erased, and when you read it slowly in the quiet, that unfinished feeling becomes difficult to ignore, as if the clay tablets are not telling us how everything began, but reminding us that something ended. If Sumerian language feels like a survivor, their knowledge feels like an inheritance, because knowledge, like language, usually leaves a trail. We expect to see mistakes, crude versions, early failures buried beneath later success. When archaeologists study the development of civilizations elsewhere, that pattern appears clearly. In Egypt, we can trace architecture from simple mud brick structures to stone temples. In the Indus Valley, we see villages slowly experimenting with drainage before mastering urban sanitation. In China, metallurgy evolves through imperfect alloys before reaching refinement. Progress leaves scars. But Sumer's record is strangely clean. Their mathematics appears fully operational from the start. Clay tablets used in scribal schools show students practicing multiplication, division, fractions, and geometric calculations. Not basic counting, Advanced operations. One tablet shows an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places. That level of precision would not be formally rediscovered in the West for thousands of years. This is not beginner math. This is knowledge being taught to children, which means adults already understood it well enough to formalize it. And again, there is no visible learning curve. No discarded systems, no competing bases, no evidence of trial and error mathematics. The sexagesimal system is simply there, embedded in trade, construction, astronomy, and timekeeping. Someone understood its advantages deeply enough to standardize it across society. Then there is their astronomy. Sumerian tablets record the movements of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. They tracked its appearances and disappearances across years, noting patterns that only become visible through long-term observation. This requires patience, consistency, institutional memory. You don't discover planetary cycles by accident. You need generations of watchers recording night after night, comparing records across decades. The Venus tablets preserved in later Babylonian copies are not speculative texts. They are logs, data, which means the observations they preserve likely began long before the tablets we have. The same applies to their understanding of eclipses, solstices, and celestial alignments. Ziggurats were not randomly oriented. Their corners align with cardinal directions. Their stairways correspond to solar events. Their placement suggests an understanding of how the sky moves relative to the horizon. Again, this is not knowledge that appears suddenly in isolation. It accumulates slowly, unless it is inherited. Sumerian medicine tells the same story. The earliest medical tablets describe treatments using specific plants, minerals, and preparation methods. These are not ritual incantations disguised as healing. They are practical prescriptions. Willow bark for pain, thyme for infections, fermented substances for digestion. Modern science has confirmed that many of these treatments work, which means someone observed cause and effect carefully enough to distinguish effective remedies from harmful ones. That takes time and failure. But we don't see the failures. We see reference manuals. We see a tradition already mature enough to be taught. The same pattern repeats in metallurgy. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerians were producing bronze with remarkably consistent ratios of copper and tin. Too much tin makes bronze brittle. Too little makes it ineffective. Their alloys fall within optimal ranges. Again, no experimental debris, no generations of failed castings, just competence. This pattern extends to law. The earliest Sumerian legal texts show nuanced understanding of human behavior. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They address property disputes, inheritance, contracts, and compensation. These are not simplistic codes. They assume experience. Legal systems usually evolve through conflict, cases revealing gaps, prompting revisions. But Sumerian law appears already aware of those gaps, as if the lawmakers already knew what problems would arise. All of this raises the same uncomfortable question. Where did the learning happen? If Sumerians developed this knowledge themselves, where are the traces of development? If they inherited it, from whom? The Sumerians give an answer, though not one modern readers are comfortable with. They say the knowledge was given by figures they call the Anunnaki. Modern retellings often sensationalize this term, stripping it of context. But in Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are not vague sky beings. They are administrators, teachers, lawgivers. They are described as organizing agriculture, teaching writing, establishing measurement systems, and setting divine decrees, which function more like laws of order than moral commandments. These figures are not omnipotent. They argue. They make mistakes. They debate policy. They sound less like abstract gods and more like remembered authorities. Whether these accounts are symbolic or historical is less important than their structure. The Sumerians consistently attribute their sophistication to instruction, not inspiration. Instruction. That distinction matters, because instruction implies teachers, and teachers imply continuity, which brings us back to the sense of incompleteness. If Sumer inherited knowledge, then they are not the origin point. They are the archive, a civilization that arrived carrying fragments of something older, something damaged, something partially forgotten. Their texts often express anxiety about loss. They emphasize copying accurately, preserving words exactly, maintaining traditions even when their meaning is unclear. This is not the behavior of innovators. It is the behavior of caretakers, of people who know that what they hold is fragile, that it survived something terrible and might not survive again. This explains why Sumer feels unfinished, because it behaves like a culture standing at the edge of amnesia, aware that it remembers more than others, but less than those who came before, aware that it is not the beginning but also not the end, caught in the middle, and perhaps that is why their story still resonates. Because we recognize that feeling, we too live surrounded by inherited systems we did not create. Technologies we use without fully understanding, languages layered with meanings older than memory, knowledge passed down, abstracted, simplified. Sumer mirrors us in an unsettling way, not as our origin, but as an earlier moment when humanity stood after a collapse, trying to rebuild meaning from fragments, trying to preserve what mattered, trying to finish a story that had already been broken, and maybe that is the quiet truth beneath the clay. Sumer does not feel unfinished because it failed. It feels unfinished because it was never meant to be the first chapter. It was a continuation, and continuations always carry echoes of what came before. If there is one idea that holds the entire Sumerian worldview together, it is not gods, not kings, and not cities. It is rupture. The Sumerians did not see time as a smooth line. They saw it as something broken. Their texts return obsessively to the same dividing moment, before the flood, after the flood. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is structural. Their king lists, for example, are not simple chronicles. They are organized around this break. Before the flood, kings reign for impossible lengths of time, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shrink dramatically, still exaggerated but recognizably human. Scholars often dismiss the early section as pure myth, but the numbers are too precise to be random. They follow mathematical patterns tied to Sumerian units of time, multiples of 60, multiples of 3600. This suggests encoding, not fantasy. The king list reads less like legend and more like a damaged record, as if the scribes were copying something they no longer fully understood, preserving numbers because accuracy mattered, even when meaning had been lost. And then there is the flood itself. For a long time, modern scholars assumed the flood stories were symbolic, exaggerated memories of seasonal river overflow. But archaeology complicated that assumption. At multiple Sumerian sites, excavators found thick layers of sterile silt separating two distinct phases of human occupation. Not gradual accumulation, not annual flooding, a single, overwhelming event. Leonard Woolley's excavation at revealed more than 2 meters of flood clay. Below it, a city. Above it, another city. No transition, just interruption. Similar layers appeared at Shuruppak and Kish. The flood was not global, but within the world the Sumerians knew it was total. Their fields, their archives, their infrastructure, gone. If a civilization existed before that flood, even a regional one, its physical traces would have been buried, dissolved, or washed away. But memory could survive. Stories told by survivors, skills passed down informally. Knowledge preserved through practice rather than writing. And when writing finally appears in Sumer, it does not read like invention. It reads like capture, as if the scribes were racing against forgetting. This explains the urgency we sense in their texts, the insistence on copying accurately, the reverence for ancient words, the emphasis on restoration. They knew something had already been lost once. They feared losing it again. This also reframes how we should read their myths. The flood stories are not just about destruction. They are about discontinuity. A world ends, another begins, but not from nothing, from fragments. And that pattern repeats across cultures. Flood narratives appear in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, the Americas. Different details, same structure, a catastrophic reset, survivors, rebuilding. Whether these stories preserve one shared event or multiple regional disasters matters less than the shared psychological imprint. Humanity remembers rupture, and Sumer may represent the first attempt to stabilize memory after one. That would explain why their civilization feels both advanced and anxious. Advanced in knowledge, anxious in tone. They knew how fragile continuity was. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. If Sumer is a post-collapse civilization, then its sudden sophistication is not mysterious. It is expected. Rebuilding societies often compress development. They reuse existing knowledge rather than rediscover it. They prioritize functionality over experimentation. They skip the learning curve because someone remembers, even partially. This would explain why Sumer lacks developmental debris. The debris belonged to a previous world, buried. The Sumerians were not inventing civilization. They were reassembling it from memory, ritual, and inherited instruction, and they never claimed otherwise. Their own words say so, again and again. We restored what was before, not metaphorically, practically. This is why Sumer feels unfinished, because it stands at the edge of two worlds, one erased, one emerging. And when you stand in that place, you are always looking backward and forward at the same time, trying to preserve what you remember, trying to adapt to what you no longer fully understand. That tension runs through everything they left behind. Their myths sound like memories struggling to stay intact. Their numbers sound like calendars stripped of context. Their language sounds like a fossil. Even their gods feel unfinished. They are powerful but limited, wise but fallible, teachers, not creators. They argue, they regret, they react. They feel like echoes of real authority figures whose stories were elevated as memory faded. And when memory fades, meaning changes. What was once instruction becomes worship. What was once leadership becomes divinity. That transition leaves marks. Marks we can still see. The flood did not just erase cities. It fractured understanding. And Sumer is what happens when a culture tries to bridge that fracture. Not fully succeeding, not fully failing, just holding on. That is why Sumer does not sit comfortably at the beginning of history. It feels like a chapter written after something was torn out, a civilization aware that it is continuing a story it did not start, and unsure how it will end. There is a reason this story refuses to stay in the past. The Sumerians feel unfinished not only archaeologically, but emotionally. When people encounter their history, even casually, even through a late-night video meant to induce sleep, they react in a strangely consistent way. They don't just feel curious. They feel unsettled, comforted, and disturbed at the same time. This reaction appears again and again in the comments, in private messages, in long reflections written at 3 in the morning. People say the same things, using different words. This feels familiar. This makes me question everything. This helps me sleep, but also keeps me awake. That contradiction is important. It suggests that something in the Sumerian story resonates below conscious reasoning, not because the details are proven, but because the pattern is recognizable. A lost world, a catastrophe, survivors rebuilding with fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understand. That pattern mirrors something deeply human. Every individual life contains rupture, before-after. A childhood that ends, a loss that changes everything, a moment when continuity breaks and the world is reorganized around absence. Cultures experience this too, and when they do, they encode the trauma in story, not as analysis, as memory. The Sumerians were not asking, how did civilization begin? They were asking, how do we keep it from disappearing again? That question shaped everything they did. Why preserve clay tablets instead of perishable materials? Why obsess over copying ancient texts word for word? Why treat language as sacred even when it was no longer spoken? Because preservation had failed once. They knew what forgetting cost. This makes their civilization feel less like a triumphant beginning and more like a vigil. They are guarding something, standing watch over memory, and that posture changes how we should listen to them. We often approach ancient civilizations looking for origins, first cities, first writing, first laws. But Sumer is not pointing forward. It is pointing backward, saying, this was already old when we received it. That is a disturbing message for modern culture. We like linear progress. We like to believe knowledge accumulates smoothly, that we are smarter than the past, that time equals improvement. The Sumerians quietly challenge that assumption. They suggest that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can collapse completely, that rebuilding does not mean advancement, only survival, and survival often looks sophisticated because it borrows. This idea feels uncomfortably relevant. We live in a world that depends on systems most people do not understand. Electric grids, digital networks, medical infrastructure, global supply chains. We inherit functioning complexity without knowing how to recreate it from scratch. If those systems failed, we would not reinvent them easily. We would preserve fragments, manuals, rituals, stories. We would mythologize engineers the way Sumer mythologized teachers, and future generations might wonder how we knew so much so suddenly. Sumer may not be ancient mystery. It may be a mirror, a reminder of how fragile continuity is. This also reframes the emotional tone of their myths. The gods are not serene creators. They are anxious managers. They worry about labor shortages. They argue about consequences. They regret their decisions. These are not cosmic archetypes. They are administrative personalities, beings responsible for maintaining a system under stress. That tone suggests lived experience, a world held together with effort, a world that had already failed once. And when you read their creation stories this way, the emphasis on trial and error becomes haunting, not poetic, practical, as if they were saying, "We tried before. It didn't work. We adjusted." That is not how gods speak. That is how survivors speak. This is why Sumer does not offer closure. There is no final revelation, no clear answer about who came before, no explanation of where the teachers went. The record simply stops. Later cultures inherit pieces. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, each reinterpret the fragments, but none recover the whole. The chain of memory remains broken, and that break is still visible. We feel it when we ask questions that have no answers. Where did the knowledge come from? Why was it already complete? What was lost beneath the flood layers? Why does the language stand alone? The discomfort comes from recognizing a pattern without resolution. We are wired to seek beginnings, but Sumer offers aftermath, and aftermath is harder to process. It forces us to sit with uncertainty, with the possibility that history did not start where we think it did, and that what we call myth may be damaged memory, stripped of context but not meaning. This is why the Sumerians feel unfinished, because they were unfinished. They were in the middle of recovery, and recovery does not produce neat stories. It produces fragments, and fragments are what they left us. Clay tablets cracked and incomplete, sentences that reference things no longer explained, numbers that imply systems no longer visible, stories that feel like summaries of something much larger. We are not reading the beginning of the human story. We are reading what survived. And perhaps that is why these texts feel strangely intimate. They were never meant to impress us. They were meant to remember. And memory, once broken, never fully heals. If the Sumerians were not the beginning, then what were they? They were not founders standing at the dawn of history. They were caretakers standing in the ruins. And caretakers always live with a specific fear, not of ignorance, but of loss. Everything about Sumerian civilization suggests an obsession with continuity. They archived, they copied, they standardized. They trained scribes to replicate texts exactly, even when meaning was unclear. This is not how innovators behave. This is how archivists behave. People who understand that once something disappears, it may never return. In Sumerian scribal schools, students were punished not for misunderstanding, but for deviation. A line copied incorrectly was corrected. A symbol altered was rewritten. The goal was not interpretation, it was fidelity. That alone tells us something profound. They were not trying to advance knowledge, they were trying to prevent erosion. This is why their civilization feels heavy. Not triumphant, not optimistic. There is no narrative of destiny or progress, only maintenance, only balance, only keeping the world from slipping again. Their gods mirror this anxiety. They are administrators of fragile systems. They hold councils. They issue decrees. They argue over consequences. They fear unintended outcomes. In modern terms, they behave like crisis managers, not creators of paradise, managers of aftermath. And when catastrophe comes, the flood, it is not framed as a moral cleansing. It is framed as a system failure. Too much noise, too much strain, too much imbalance. And afterward, nothing is new. Kingship is lowered again. Cities are rebuilt. Rituals resume. The same structures restored. This language matters. Restoration is not rebirth. Restoration assumes a prior state and a prior loss, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. The Sumerians may have understood something about civilization that we prefer to forget. That complexity does not guarantee resilience. That knowledge does not ensure survival, that systems can collapse so thoroughly that only fragments remain, fragments mistaken later for origins. We assume the future will remember us, but memory is not guaranteed. The Sumerians remembered a world we cannot find. What makes us think we are immune? Imagine a future archaeologist uncovering fragments of our world, data storage corrupted, languages extinct, context gone. They might find algorithms without explanations, devices without manuals, structures whose purpose is unclear, and they might conclude that our civilization appeared suddenly, fully formed, mysterious, advanced beyond its surroundings. They would be wrong, but only because the continuity was lost. This is the Sumerian warning. Not that gods created humanity, but that memory is fragile, and when it breaks, history becomes myth. The Sumerians sit at the threshold where memory turns into story, where documentation becomes allegory, where testimony is mistaken for theology, and once that shift happens, recovery becomes almost impossible. You can excavate artifacts, you can translate symbols, but you cannot reconstruct context once the living chain is broken. That is why so many Sumerian texts feel incomplete. They reference institutions we do not recognize, practices no longer explained, titles without clear function. They assume shared understanding that no longer exists. They were not writing for us, they were writing for those who still remembered. That audience is gone, and we are left listening through a broken signal. This also explains why later civilizations treated Sumer with reverence. Babylonians called it ancient even by their standards. Assyrians preserved its language long after it was dead. They sensed depth, weight. They knew Sumer carried something older than itself, and instead of replacing it, they preserved it, as if afraid that removing it would collapse the foundation beneath them. That instinct was correct, because civilizations do not sit on solid ground. They sit on accumulated memory. Once memory erodes, structures remain, but meaning dissolves. We still use Sumerian mathematics, but we no longer remember why 60 was chosen. We still divide circles into 360 degrees, but the cosmology behind it is gone. We inherited the tools, not the worldview, which raises the most unsettling possibility of all, that we are already living in a post-collapse world, not technologically, but cognitively, surrounded by inherited systems we barely understand, mistaking survival for progress. They're mistaking continuity for permanence. The Sumerians may not be asking us to look backward, they may be warning us to look forward, because they knew something we are beginning to rediscover, that civilizations do not end with fire or invasion, they end with forgetting. And once forgetting begins, it accelerates. Stories replace records, myths replace memory, and eventually even the myths feel unfinished. Just like Sumer, at night, when the modern world grows quiet, the Sumerians feel closer, not because they are ancient, but because silence is where unfinished things surface. They lived in a world where darkness was real, not symbolic, where night meant vulnerability, and yet it was often at night that scribes worked, oil lamps flickering, clay still damp, words pressed carefully, knowing that once the clay hardened, nothing could be changed. No edits, no revisions, only preservation. There is something deeply human in that act. Someone, thousands of years ago, believed that what they were recording mattered beyond their lifetime. That belief alone bridges time, because it is the same belief that brings someone to listen now, in the dark, half awake, wondering why these stories refuse to settle. The Sumerians did not leave us answers. They left tension, they left gaps, they left patterns that almost resolve, but never fully do. And perhaps that was intentional, because complete understanding requires continuity. And continuity was already broken when they wrote. They were writing downstream from catastrophe. Upstream knowledge was gone. They could only describe what they remembered, not what they fully understood. This is why their world feels like an echo chamber. Every explanation points backward. Every authority originates elsewhere. Every foundation rests on something older. They never say, "This began with us." They say, "This was handed down," again and again and again. In a way, Sumer is not a civilization. It is a message in a bottle, thrown across a flood of time. We found it, but we cannot fully open it, because part of the message dissolved in the water. And now we are doing what humans always do when memory fails. We interpret, we theorize, we mythologize, we argue. Some insist it was all symbolic. Others insist it was literal. But both sides may be missing the point. The Sumerians were not trying to convince. They were trying to remember. Conviction belongs to belief systems. Memory belongs to survival. And survival was their priority. If you strip away gods, floods, kings, numbers, and myths, what remains is this. They believed something precious had already been lost once, and they were terrified of losing it again. That fear shaped everything. Their architecture, their bureaucracy, their education, their religion, their obsession with order. They did not worship chaos, they feared it. And that fear was earned. Because chaos had already erased a world. Which leads to a final, uncomfortable thought. What if we are misreading the unfinished feeling entirely? What if the Sumerians feel incomplete, not because they failed to finish something, but because they never got the chance? What if the flood didn't just erase cities, but erased a trajectory, a direction civilization was moving in before it was forced to restart? If that is true, then history is not a straight line. It is a loop with missing arcs. Moments where progress resets, memory fractures, and survivors rebuild with whatever fragments they can carry forward. From that perspective, Sumer is not ancient, it is familiar, because we are doing the same thing now, archiving, backing up, digitizing, preserving, afraid of loss, afraid of collapse, afraid that something essential might vanish faster than we can explain it. We like to believe we are advancing, but advancement without memory is just repetition at a higher speed. The Sumerians may have known that. They may have understood that intelligence does not save civilizations. Continuity does. And continuity is fragile. Which is why, after all these thousands of years, their presence still feels unresolved. They are not calling us backward. They are standing beside us, at the edge of the same uncertainty, looking ahead, wondering if what we are building will endure, or if it will someday be pressed into a different kind of clay, interpreted by minds who no longer remember us. And if that happens, they may say the same thing we say now. There's something unfinished about them. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy any civilization can leave. Not certainty, not answers, but a trace, a whisper, a warning, that what truly survives is not what we build, but what we remember to preserve.